The autopsy report lay open on the medical examiner's desk in Cambridge, Massachusetts, dated August 13th, 1901, and the findings made no anatomical sense. Genevieve Gordon's heart showed no disease. Her liver revealed no pathology. Her brain presented no hemorrhage. Yet, she had died screaming. Her body contorted in a final spasm that had twisted the bedsheets into knots so tight the undertaker had been forced to cut them away. The August humidity pressed against the windows of the cramped office, carrying the distant clang of trolley bells from Harvard Square, and somewhere in the files scattered across the examiner's desk was a notation that would haunt Massachusetts medicine for a century. In the final moments before death, witnesses reported that Genevieve's attending nurse, a cheerful, round-faced woman named Jane Toppan, had climbed into the bed beside her patient, cradling the dying woman in her arms, her face pressed close to Genevieve's as the life left her body. The nurse was smiling, and when investigators would later trace Jane Toppan's career backward through hospitals, private homes, and family residences across New England, they would discover something impossible. In nearly 2 decades of nursing, not a single patient under her exclusive care had survived. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The woman who would become America's most prolific female serial killer was not born Jane Toppan. She entered the world as Honora Kelly on March 31st, 1857, in the working-class Irish neighborhood of Boston, known as the Fort Hill District, a place where the brick tenements pressed so close together that neighbors could hear each other's prayers through the walls. Her father, Peter Kelly, was a tailor who worked 16-hour days in a cramped shop on Washington Street, his fingers stained permanently with dye, his lungs slowly filling with the fiber dust that would eventually kill him. Her mother, Bridget, died when Honora was barely a year old. Consumption, the doctors said, though in that era the diagnosis covered everything from tuberculosis to simple exhaustion. Peter Kelly was not equipped for widowhood. The man who had once been known for his precision with a needle began to unravel in ways that made even his tolerant Irish Catholic neighbors uneasy. He talked to himself on the street. He accused his eldest daughter, Delia, of stealing from him. He sewed the curtains to his coat one morning and walked to work that way, insisting that the fabric was a gift from the Virgin Mary. Within 2 years of Bridget's death, Peter Kelly had earned a nickname in the neighborhood that would follow him to his grave, Kelly the Crack, a reference to his cracked mind, his fractured grip on reality. By 1863, when Honora was 6 years old, her father had deteriorated to the point where the Boston authorities intervened. Delia, the eldest, was already showing signs of what the era called moral weakness. She would eventually be committed to an asylum after working as a prostitute in the city's North End. But little Honora was deemed salvageable. On a grey November afternoon, Peter Kelly walked his youngest daughter to the Boston Female Asylum, an institution for destitute and orphaned girls housed in a severe granite building on Washington Street. He signed the papers admitting her to the asylum's care. He promised to return for her when he was well again. He never came back. The Boston Female Asylum operated on principles that would seem cruel by modern standards, but were considered progressive in their time. The girls were taught to read and write, trained in domestic service, and placed out as indentured servants in respectable Protestant households when they reached a suitable age. The emphasis on Protestant was not accidental. The asylum's founders believed that Irish Catholic children, products of poverty and popery, required complete reformation of character. Honora Kelly arrived at the institution as a Catholic, but she would leave it stripped of her faith, her family, and her name. In 1864, when Honora was 7, the asylum placed her with Anne C. Toppan, a widow who lived in the quiet town of Lowell, some 25 miles north of Boston. Anne Toppan needed a servant. The asylum needed to place children. No formal adoption ever occurred. Honora remained technically a ward of the asylum, indentured to the Toppan household. But somewhere in those early years, the girl shed her Irish identity like a snake shedding its skin. She became Jane, though no legal name change was ever filed. She became a Toppan, though she never had any claim to the family's modest inheritance. She became, in essence, a ghost, a person with no birth certificate in her new name, no baptismal record, no documentary proof that she existed at all. The Toppan household in Lowell was not wealthy, but it was respectable, a crucial distinction in 19th century New England. Anne Toppan was a deacon's widow, a woman whose social standing derived entirely from her association with the Congregational Church and her reputation for moral rectitude. She took in the Irish orphan as an act of Christian charity, and she expected gratitude in return. Jane provided it, at least outwardly. She learned to cook and clean to Mrs. Toppan's exacting standards. She attended church every Sunday, sitting in the hard wooden pews with her hands folded and her eyes downcast. She called Anne Toppan mother and Anne's biological daughter, Elizabeth, sister, and she played the role of the grateful poor relation with such conviction that the neighbors considered her a success story. But there were cracks in the performance, visible only to those who looked closely. Elizabeth Toppan would later recall that Jane had a peculiar habit of watching people, not the casual glances of normal social interaction, but a fixed, unblinking stare that seemed to catalogue every gesture, every expression, every vulnerability. When the family cat died suddenly in 1870, Jane showed no distress. She asked instead if she could watch the body decompose, a request that struck Elizabeth as so strange that she remembered it decades later. And there was the incident with the neighbor's baby, a story that circulated through Lowell in whispered fragments. Jane had been left alone with the infant for only a few minutes, and when the mother returned, she found the baby silent and pale, Jane leaning over the crib with an expression that the mother would later describe with a shudder as hungry. Nothing was ever proven, nothing was ever charged. The baby survived, though the mother refused to leave Jane alone with any child again. And Jane continued her careful performance of normalcy, attending church, learning needlework, preparing herself for the limited options available to a woman of her station in the 1870s. She could become a domestic servant, spending her life in other people's kitchens. She could marry, though her lack of dowry and family connections made her prospects slim. Or she could enter one of the few professions that offered women both respectability and independence: nursing. The Cambridge Hospital Training School for Nurses admitted Jane Toppan in 1885 when she was 28 years old. This was late for a nursing student. Most of her classmates were in their early 20s. But Jane explained the delay by citing her obligations to her foster mother, who had recently died. The explanation was accepted. The references she provided were glowing, and Jane Toppan proved to be an apt pupil, mastering the techniques of patient care with a speed that impressed her instructors. Nursing in the 1880s was not the profession it would become. Florence Nightingale had established the foundations of modern nursing during the Crimean War, but her reforms had penetrated American hospitals unevenly. The Cambridge Hospital was progressive by the standards of the era. It required 2 years of training, emphasized hygiene and record-keeping, and treated nurses as professionals rather than glorified servants. But the profession still operated in the long shadow of medicine's male hierarchy. Nurses were expected to defer to doctors in all clinical matters. They were forbidden from diagnosing conditions or prescribing treatments. Their role was to observe, to comfort, and to obey. Jane Toppan learned the official curriculum with diligence. She learned how to take a pulse and record a temperature. She learned how to change dressings and administer medications. She learned the careful choreography of the sick room, how to enter quietly, how to position the patient for comfort, how to maintain the calm and order that were considered essential to recovery. But she was also learning something else, something that no instructor taught and no textbook described. She was learning the locations of the medicine cabinets, the schedules of the supervising physicians, and the particular vulnerabilities of patients who were too sick to advocate for themselves. The Cambridge Hospital kept morphine and atropine in locked cabinets, but the locks were simple, and the keys were entrusted to senior staff members who were often too busy to monitor every dose. Morphine was the miracle drug of the era. It relieved pain, induced sleep, and calmed the anxiety of the dying. Atropine was its opposite, a stimulant derived from the belladonna plant, used to counteract the respiratory depression that morphine could cause. In the right hands, the two drugs could be calibrated to manage the delicate balance between comfort and consciousness. In the wrong hands, they could create something else entirely, a pharmaceutical roller coaster that brought patients to the edge of death and back again, over and over, until the final dose pushed them over the edge for good. Jane Toppan began to experiment. Her first victim, or at least the first victim that investigators would later identify, was a patient whose name has been lost to history, an elderly man admitted to Cambridge Hospital in 1887 with what the admitting physician described as general debility. The man was not expected to recover, but he was not expected to die quickly either. His family visited daily, noting each fluctuation in his condition with the anxious hope of relatives who could not accept the inevitable. And then, one evening, the man's condition suddenly deteriorated. His breathing became shallow. His pulse raced, then slowed, then raced again. The attending nurse, Jane Toppan, summoned the doctor on duty, who arrived to find the patient in extremis. By midnight, the man was dead. The death was recorded as natural. The doctor signed the certificate without hesitation. The patient had been old, had been sick, had been dying anyway. No autopsy was performed, no questions were asked. And Jane Toppan learned the most important lesson of her career, that certain patients, in certain conditions, could die without anyone noticing that they had been murdered. Over the next 2 years, Jane refined her technique. She discovered that the combination of morphine and atropine produced a particular pattern of symptoms: the racing heart, the constricted pupils, the periods of deep unconsciousness, followed by brief, disoriented awakenings, that she found not just useful but fascinating. She began to time her doses more precisely, bringing patients to the threshold of death and holding them there for hours, sometimes climbing into bed beside them to feel their hearts slow against her chest. When she finally administered the lethal dose, she watched their faces with an attention that later witnesses would describe as rapt, almost worshipful. She called it getting the better of them. She called it having them at her mercy. In her own private language, she was not killing, but conquering, asserting a control over life and death that the doctors, with all their education and authority, could never achieve. The Cambridge Hospital began to notice that Jane Toppan's patients died at unusual rates. The supervising nurses remarked that her wards seemed to experience more crises than others. But the remarks never coalesced into suspicion, for several reasons. First, 19th century hospitals were deadly places. Infection, misdiagnosis, and surgical error killed patients constantly, and a slightly elevated death rate on a particular nurse's watch was not immediately remarkable. Second, Jane Toppan was charming. She told jokes. She brought treats for the other nurses. She stayed late with dying patients, holding their hands through the final hours, and she always seemed genuinely distressed when they passed. The doctors liked her, the families trusted her, and the patients, the ones who survived, praised her care. In 1889, the Cambridge Hospital dismissed Jane Toppan. The official reason was never clearly documented, though later investigators would piece together fragments of the story. Drugs had gone missing from the medicine cabinet. A patient had accused Jane of inappropriate conduct. The nature of the conduct was never specified, but it seemed to involve Jane's tendency to climb into bed with the sick. Another nurse had complained that Jane had made strange comments about knowing what death looks like. The dismissal was quiet, almost apologetic. Jane was told that she was not suited to hospital nursing and advised to seek employment in private homes where her particular gifts, her warmth, her attentiveness, her willingness to work long hours would be better appreciated. Jane Toppan left the Cambridge hospital without a reference, which should have ended her nursing career. Instead, she walked 3 miles to the Massachusetts General Hospital and applied for a position there, presenting herself as a Cambridge graduate who was seeking additional training. The Massachusetts General accepted her. The Cambridge Hospital, when contacted, declined to elaborate on the circumstances of her departure, and Jane Toppan resumed her experiments. The Massachusetts General was larger and busier than Cambridge, which meant that oversight was even more difficult. Jane worked in the surgical wards, where patients were already in pain, already medicated, already in states of consciousness that made accurate observation nearly impossible. She continued to steal morphine and atropine. She continued to experiment with dosages and timing. And she continued to kill. How many victims died at Massachusetts General during Jane Toppan's tenure? The question would torment investigators for years. The hospital's records from that period were incomplete, and the institution had every incentive to minimize the scandal when it finally emerged. Estimates ranged from a handful to several dozen. What was certain was that Jane Toppan left Massachusetts General in 1890 under circumstances similar to her departure from Cambridge, dismissed quietly, advised to seek private employment, sent into the world without the blemish of formal charges or public scandal. She landed on her feet. She always landed on her feet. By 1891, Jane Toppan had established herself as a private nurse in the wealthy seaside communities north of Boston, Cambridge, Arlington, Somerville, and the quiet village of Catomet on Cape Cod. Her reputation preceded her, carefully cultivated through church connections, professional references, and the grateful testimonials of families who had employed her in the past. She was known as Jolly Jane, a nickname that referenced her cheerful demeanor, her easy laugh, her ability to bring levity to the sick room. Families hired her to care for elderly parents, recovering surgical patients, and sickly children. She came highly recommended. She came with years of hospital experience, and wherever she went, people started to die. The pattern was consistent, but nearly invisible. Jane would arrive at a household in crisis, a patriarch suffering from heart disease, a matriarch weakened by pneumonia, a young wife struggling with complications from childbirth. She would establish herself as indispensable, working 18-hour days, sleeping in the patient's room, charming the family with her warmth and dedication. The patient's condition would fluctuate unpredictably, improving and declining in cycles that kept the family on edge. And then, just when hope seemed reasonable, the patient would die. Suddenly, peacefully, in the arms of the devoted nurse who had fought so hard to save them. The families were grateful. They paid Jane handsomely. They wrote letters of recommendation, praising her skill and compassion. And they never suspected that the kind nurse who had held their mother's hand at the moment of death had also administered the poison that stopped her heart. Between 1891 and 1901, Jane Toppan killed at least 31 people. The true number was almost certainly higher, perhaps much higher, but 31 was the count that investigators would eventually confirm through exhumations, witness testimony, and Jane's own confessions. The victims included patients, yes, but also friends, landlords, and the members of a single family that Jane systematically annihilated over the course of a single summer. The Davis family of Cambridge represented Jane Toppan's most concentrated period of killing, and their destruction would ultimately lead to her capture. But to understand how a single nurse could murder an entire family without arousing suspicion, it is necessary to understand the world in which she operated. A world where death was common, medicine was primitive, and the idea that a woman could be a serial murderer was virtually unthinkable. Alden Davis was a businessman in his 60s, a deacon at the local Congregational church, and the patriarch of a respectable Cambridge family. His wife, Mattie, was a decade younger, a woman known for her piety and her charitable works. Their daughters, Annie and Minnie, had married well and moved to homes of their own. The Davis household was comfortable, conventional, and utterly unsuspecting when Jane Toppan entered their lives in the spring of 1901. Jane had known the family for years. She had rented rooms from the Davises in the 1890s, and she had maintained the friendship even after moving to other quarters. When Mattie Davis fell ill in the summer of 1901, a vague complaint of weakness and digestive distress, it was natural for the family to turn to their old friend Jane, the experienced nurse who had cared for so many ailing relatives throughout the community. Jane moved into the Davis home in late June, promising to restore Mattie to health. Mattie Davis died on July 4, 1901. The death was attributed to heart failure, complicated by the digestive illness that had been troubling her for weeks. Alden Davis was devastated. His daughters rushed home to comfort him and help with the funeral arrangements, and Jane Toppan, who had nursed Mattie so devotedly in her final days, offered to stay on and help the family through their grief. What happened next would later be described by investigators as a killing spree, though the term did not exist in the vocabulary of 1901. Within 6 weeks of Mattie Davis's death, 3 more members of the family would be in their graves. Annie Gordon, Mattie's older daughter, arrived at her father's house in mid-July, still wearing mourning for her mother. She was in her early 30s, married to a man named George Gordon, and in apparent good health. But within days of her arrival, Annie began to experience the same vague symptoms that had troubled her mother. Weakness, digestive distress, periods of confusion and disorientation. Jane Toppan assumed responsibility for Annie's care, just as she had cared for Mattie. The pattern repeated itself with terrible precision. Annie's condition fluctuated wildly, improving and declining in cycles that exhausted her husband and terrified her father. And on August 13, 1901, Annie Gordon died in Jane Toppan's arms. Alden Davis was now burying his second family member in less than 2 months. The strain was visible on his face, audible in his voice. His remaining daughter, Minnie, was frantic with grief and fear. What was happening to her family? What disease was cutting them down one by one? Jane Toppan soothed her, consoled her, and offered to stay with Alden Davis to help him through the crisis. Minnie accepted gratefully. She had no reason to suspect the woman who had been such a faithful friend to her family. 2 weeks later, Alden Davis himself fell ill. The symptoms were by now grimly familiar: weakness, confusion, digestive distress, periods of deep unconsciousness followed by brief, disoriented awakenings. Jane Toppan nursed him through the crisis, but on August 26, 1901, Alden Davis joined his wife and daughter in death. Minnie Gibbs was the last of the immediate family. She arrived at her father's house to settle his affairs, numb with grief and exhausted by the relentless succession of funerals. Jane Toppan was still there, still helpful, still offering her services as nurse and companion. Minnie was grateful for the support. She trusted Jane completely. And when Minnie herself began to feel unwell in late August, she accepted Jane's ministrations without question. Minnie Gibbs died on August 29, 1901, 3 days after her father. In the space of 8 weeks, Jane Toppan had killed 4 members of a single family. The deaths of the Davis family did not immediately arouse suspicion. The family physician, Dr. Leonard Latter, signed the death certificates without hesitation. Mattie had died of heart failure, Annie of heart failure complicated by her mother's illness, Alden of heart failure compounded by grief, and Minnie of some combination of all 3. The diagnoses were vague, but plausible. The family had been under tremendous stress, and the idea that their trusted nurse, Their friend might have poisoned them was simply inconceivable. But the Davis family had relatives who were not so easily satisfied. Captain Paul Gibbs was Minnie's father-in-law, a retired sea captain who had made his fortune in the coastal trade and retired to a comfortable home in Toppan. He had watched the Davis family die one by one, and something about the pattern troubled him. It was not suspicion exactly, not yet, but a nagging sense that the deaths were too convenient, too rapid, too neatly clustered around the presence of a single woman. Captain Gibbs began to ask questions. He spoke to Dr. Latter about the causes of death and found the physician's explanations unsatisfying. He spoke to neighbors who had observed Jane Toppan's behavior during the family's illnesses and heard troubling details. Jane's tendency to give the patients special medicines that she prepared herself, her insistence on being alone with the dying, her strange habit of climbing into bed beside them in their final hours. And he spoke to other families who had employed Jane Toppan in the past, families who had lost loved ones under her care. The more Captain Gibbs investigated, the more disturbed he became. The pattern was unmistakable. Wherever Jane Toppan went, people died. Not just patients, but healthy people, friends, landlords, relatives of patients. The death rate was far too high to be coincidence, but the idea that a nurse, a woman, could be systematically murdering her charges was so far outside Captain Gibbs's experience that he struggled to articulate his suspicions. In late September 1901, Captain Gibbs contacted the Massachusetts State Police. He told them what he had discovered. He told them about the Davis family. He told them about the other deaths that seemed to cluster around Jane Toppan's nursing career. And he asked them to investigate. The state police were skeptical. Serial murder was a concept that barely existed in the criminological vocabulary of 1901, and the idea that a middle-aged female nurse might be responsible for dozens of deaths was virtually unthinkable. But Captain Gibbs was a respected man, a pillar of the community, and his concerns could not be ignored entirely. The police agreed to make inquiries. What they discovered would horrify the nation. The investigation began with the exhumation of the Davis family's bodies. The autopsies were performed by Dr. Edward S. Wood, a professor of chemistry at Harvard Medical School and one of the foremost toxicologists in the country. Dr. Wood analyzed tissue samples from Mattie Davis, Annie Gordon, Alden Davis, and Minnie Gibbs. In each case, he found the same result: elevated levels of morphine and atropine far beyond any therapeutic dose. The Davis family had not died of heart failure. They had been poisoned. The police obtained a warrant for Jane Toppan's arrest. They found her in Toppan, where she was nursing yet another patient, a woman who, investigators would later determine, had been receiving suspicious medications that Jane prepared herself. Jane was taken into custody on October 29, 1901. She was 44 years old, plump and cheerful, and she expressed complete bewilderment at the accusations against her. The initial interrogation went nowhere. Jane denied everything, professed her innocence, and reminded the police of her years of dedicated service to the sick and dying. She was a nurse, she said. She had devoted her life to healing. The suggestion that she might have harmed her patients was not just false, but incomprehensible. But the evidence was mounting. As investigators dug deeper into Jane Toppan's past, they discovered a trail of unexplained deaths that stretched back more than a decade. Former patients who had died suddenly under her care, landlords who had succumbed to mysterious illnesses after disputes with their tenant. Even Jane's own foster sister, Elizabeth Toppan, had died under suspicious circumstances in 1899, leaving Jane as the sole beneficiary of the Toppan family's modest estate. The police exhumed more bodies. The toxicology results were consistent. Morphine and atropine, in lethal doses, administered by the nurse who had been entrusted with the victim's care. Faced with the accumulating evidence, Jane Toppan finally confessed. Her confession, given over several days in late 1901 and early 1902, would become one of the most chilling documents in American criminal history. Jane admitted to killing 31 people, though she suggested that the true number might be higher, as she could not recall all of her victims with precision. She described her methods in clinical detail: the careful acquisition of morphine and atropine from hospital supplies and private physicians, the precise calibration of doses to produce the desired effects, the long hours spent observing her victims as they slipped toward death. But what shocked investigators most was not the number of victims or the sophistication of the methods. It was Jane Toppan's motivation, or rather, the absence of any motivation that the investigators could understand. She had not killed for money, though she occasionally stole from her victims. She had not killed for revenge, though some of her victims had slighted her in minor ways. She had not killed to cover up other crimes, though she had sometimes used murder to escape difficult situations. She had killed, she explained, because she enjoyed it. "I wanted to have them die with me alone," Jane told investigators. "I wanted to be there to see them suffer, to hold them as they struggled, to watch the life leave their eyes. It gave me a feeling of, pleasure is not the right word, satisfaction, completeness. As if, in that moment, I was finally powerful." The confession continued for hours, then days. Jane described the particular thrill of bringing a patient to the edge of death and holding them there. The intimate connection she felt when she climbed into bed beside a dying victim and pressed her body against theirs. She described the disappointment she felt when a victim died too quickly, before she could fully savor the experience. And she described, with what investigators could only interpret as pride, the skills she had developed in evading detection, the careful selection of victims who were already sick, the use of poisons that mimicked natural causes, the cultivation of a cheerful persona that disarmed suspicion. "I could have gone on forever," Jane said. "No one would have caught me. If that old sea captain hadn't started asking questions, I would still be nursing today." The confession presented the Massachusetts legal system with an unprecedented challenge. Jane Toppan had admitted to killing 31 people, more victims than any American murderer in recorded history. But her cheerful demeanor, her apparent lack of remorse, and the bizarre sexual undertones of her crimes suggested that she might be insane, beyond the reach of conventional justice. Massachusetts law in 1901 recognized the insanity defense, but the standards were narrow. To be found not guilty by reason of insanity, a defendant had to demonstrate that she was unable to distinguish right from wrong at the time of the crime. Jane Toppan clearly knew that murder was wrong. She had gone to elaborate lengths to conceal her crimes after all, but her motivations were so alien, so incomprehensible to the alienists, as psychiatrists were then called, who examined her, that they struggled to classify her condition. Dr. Henry R. Stedman, the superintendent of the Boston Insane Hospital and one of the most respected alienists in New England, examined Jane Toppan over several weeks in early 1902. His report to the court would shape the legal understanding of psychopathy for decades to come. "The defendant is not insane in the legal sense," Dr. Stedman wrote. "She understands the nature of her acts and recognizes that they are wrong by the standards of society. But she is morally insane, a term I use with some hesitation, as it lacks precise medical definition. She is incapable of experiencing the normal human emotions that restrain criminal behavior: empathy, guilt, remorse, fear of punishment. She is, in the truest sense, a moral void, a person whose inner life is so fundamentally different from that of normal human beings that she cannot be held to the same standards of responsibility." The concept of moral insanity was controversial even in 1902. Critics argued that it excused evil behavior, that it allowed criminals to escape the consequences of their actions by claiming a deficiency of character rather than a deficiency of reason. Prosecutors in the Toppan case pushed for a finding of sanity, which would allow the state to execute her for her crimes. But Dr. Stedman's testimony carried weight, and the defense argued passionately that a woman so profoundly disconnected from human emotion could not be held responsible for her actions. On June 23, 1902, a jury in Barnstable County found Jane Toppan not guilty by reason of insanity. The verdict was controversial, but not unexpected. Jane had shown no emotion throughout the trial, maintaining the same cheerful demeanor that had charmed her victims and fooled their families. She thanked the jury politely when the verdict was announced and asked the judge if she would be allowed to continue nursing in the institution where she would be confined. The judge, barely concealing his revulsion, informed her that she would never nurse again. Jane Toppan was committed to the Taunton State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, where she would spend the remaining 36 years of her life. The aftermath of the Toppan case rippled through Massachusetts medicine and beyond. Hospitals tightened their protocols for controlled substances, implementing stricter accounting procedures and more frequent audits. The nursing profession, still struggling to establish itself as a respectable career for women, faced renewed scrutiny and suspicion. And the emerging field of criminal psychology gained a new case study in the phenomenon that would later be called psychopathy, a personality structure characterized by superficial charm, lack of empathy, manipulativeness, and a complete absence of conscience. But the questions raised by Jane Toppan's crimes could not be answered by new protocols or psychological classifications. How had a woman murdered dozens of people over 2 decades without arousing suspicion? How had the most vulnerable members of society, the sick, the elderly, the dying, been left so completely at the mercy of their caregivers? And what did it say about American society that a serial killer could hide so effectively behind the mask of feminine nurturing? The answers, such as they were, lay in the intersection of gender, medicine, and power that defined nursing in the late 19th century. Jane Toppan had exploited a system that granted enormous authority to individual caregivers while providing almost no oversight or accountability. She had chosen victims who were already sick, whose deaths would be attributed to their underlying conditions rather than to any external cause. And she had cultivated a persona, cheerful, helpful, devoted, that matched perfectly the cultural expectations of what a nurse should be. In a sense, Jane Toppan's victims were killed not just by morphine and atropine, but by the assumptions of their era, the assumption that women were naturally nurturing, that nurses were selfless servants of the sick, that anyone who devoted herself to caring for others must be trustworthy. These assumptions made Jane Toppan invisible. They allowed her to kill and kill again, protected by a stereotype that she manipulated with cold precision. At Taunton State Hospital, Jane Toppan proved to be a model patient, cooperative, cheerful, and apparently content with her confinement. She never expressed remorse for her crimes, never acknowledged that she had done anything wrong. When interviewed by doctors and journalists over the years, she maintained the same breezy detachment that had characterized her confession. Yes, she had killed those people, but it had given her pleasure. And what was wrong with pleasure? She also made statements that suggested her crimes had not ended with her arrest. In 1906, she told a hospital doctor that she had killed at least 50 people, 19 more than the 31 she had previously admitted. She claimed to have poisoned several fellow patients at Taunton, though the hospital could find no evidence to support the allegations. And she told anyone who would listen that if she were ever released, she would kill as many more as she could. Ace. Whether these statements were true confessions, delusional fantasies, or deliberate provocations designed to ensure that she was never released, no one could determine. The hospital kept Jane Toppan in close confinement, monitoring her activities and restricting her contact with other patients. But the monitoring could not last forever. As the decades passed and Jane aged into a frail old woman, the intensity of the surveillance relaxed. By the 1920s, she was just another elderly patient in a crowded mental institution, her crimes fading into history, her name largely forgotten by a public that had moved on to newer sensations. Jane Toppan died at Taunton State Hospital on August 17, 1938. She was 81 years old. The cause of death was listed as old age and exhaustion, a vague diagnosis that would have been familiar to the families of her victims who had received similarly imprecise explanations for their loved ones' deaths decades earlier. No one claimed her body. She was buried in an unmarked grave on the hospital grounds, her final resting place as anonymous as the Honora Kelly she had once been. But the story of Jane Toppan did not end with her death. As the 20th century progressed, criminologists and psychologists returned again and again to her case, finding in her crimes a template for understanding the phenomenon of the angel of death, the caregiver who kills those entrusted to her care. The pattern that Jane Toppan established would recur with disturbing frequency. Janine Jones in Texas, responsible for the deaths of at least 11 infants in the 1980s. Charles Cullen in New Jersey, who killed at least 40 patients over 16 years, and dozens of others whose crimes echoed the methods and motivations that Jane Toppan had pioneered a century earlier. What these killers shared, beyond their access to vulnerable victims and lethal medications, was a particular psychological profile that Jane Toppan had exemplified. The combination of superficial charm and profound emptiness. The ability to mimic normal human emotions while feeling none of them. The satisfaction derived from power over life and death. They were, in the language that would develop after Jane Toppan's time, psychopaths. Individuals whose brains seemed to lack the capacity for empathy and conscience that restrained normal human behavior. The recognition of this pattern led, eventually, to changes in how healthcare institutions screen and monitor their employees. Background checks became more rigorous, medication tracking became more sophisticated. The deaths of patients under suspicious circumstances triggered investigations rather than routine paperwork. But the fundamental vulnerability that Jane Toppan had exploited, the trust that patients must place in their caregivers, could never be entirely eliminated. As long as the sick required care, there would be opportunities for those who wished to harm them. The Davis family lies in a cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, their graves marked by simple headstones that give no hint of the circumstances of their deaths. Mattie and Alden, Annie and Minnie, a mother, a father, 2 daughters, erased from the world in the space of 8 weeks by a woman they had considered a friend. Their descendants, such as remain, have largely forgotten the family's tragic end, the story fading into the general blur of ancestral misfortune that every family carries. Captain Paul Gibbs, the retired sea captain whose suspicions finally brought Jane Toppan to justice, died in 1912. His role in the case earned him a brief moment of fame. Newspaper articles praised his persistence and credited him with saving countless potential future victims, but like most heroes of their time, he faded into obscurity once the headlines moved on. His grave, in Katamet, bears no mention of the Toppan case. Dr. Edward S. Wood, the Harvard toxicologist who identified the poisons in the Davis family's bodies, continued his distinguished career until his death in 1923. His testimony in the Toppan case became a landmark in forensic toxicology, demonstrating the importance of chemical analysis in detecting crimes that might otherwise go unrecognized. The techniques he developed would be refined and expanded over the following century, making it progressively harder for poisoners to escape detection. And Jane Toppan herself became a footnote in the history of American crime, remembered, when she was remembered at all, as a curiosity from a distant era, a precursor to the more famous serial killers who would capture the public imagination in the late 20th century. Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer. These names eclipsed hers in the public consciousness, their crimes made vivid by the technologies of mass media that did not exist in Jane Toppan's time. But those who studied the history of murder knew that Jane Toppan had been there first. She had killed more victims than Bundy, Gacy, or Dahmer. She had evaded detection for longer than any of them, and she had done it all while wearing the mask of the kindly nurse, the caring woman, the devoted friend. A mask so effective that even those who knew her well could not see the monster behind it. In her final years at Taunton State Hospital, Jane Toppan occasionally spoke to visitors about her crimes. She never apologized. She never expressed regret. She spoke of her murders the way another person might speak of a hobby or a passion, something that had given meaning to her life, something that she missed. "I could have been a good nurse," she said once, late in her life. "I had the skills. I had the training." But the real nursing, the real art of it, was not in saving lives. It was in taking them, in holding a person's fate in your hands and deciding, moment by moment, whether they would live or die. That is power, that is control, and that is what I was born for. She smiled when she said this, the same cheerful smile that had charmed the families of her victims, that had disarmed the suspicions of her colleagues, that had allowed her to kill and kill and kill again for nearly 2 decades. The smile of Jolly Jane, the nurse who left no patient alive. The smile of a woman who had found her calling in death. The investigation into Jane Toppan's crimes did not end with her commitment to Taunton State Hospital. In the months and years following her confession, authorities continued to examine her past, attempting to determine the true scope of her murderous career. What they uncovered was a web of death that stretched far beyond the Davis family, reaching back into the 1880s and extending across the communities of eastern Massachusetts. The first confirmed victim, investigators determined, was a patient at Cambridge Hospital whose identity was never definitively established. The hospital's records from that period were incomplete, and the passage of time had erased the memories of those who might have provided testimony. But the pattern was clear. As early as 1887, patients in Jane Toppan's care were dying at rates that exceeded statistical norms, their deaths attributed to natural causes that obscured the true mechanism of their demise. From Cambridge, the trail led to Massachusetts General Hospital, where Jane had worked briefly in 1890. Here again, the deaths clustered around her shifts, her patients, her particular attention. One victim was identified with some confidence, a young woman recovering from surgery who had been making good progress until Jane Toppan assumed responsibility for her care. Within days, the woman had developed the now familiar symptoms: weakness, confusion, fluctuating consciousness, and died without ever regaining coherent awareness. The trail continued into the private homes where Jane had worked as a nurse throughout the 1890s. Investigators interviewed former employers, reviewed death certificates, and in several cases exhumed bodies for toxicological analysis. The results were consistent: morphine and atropine in doses that no legitimate nursing care would require. Among the confirmed victims were Mary McNear, an elderly widow in Cambridge, whose estate Jane had attempted to claim after her death in 1895. Israel Dunham, a landlord who had threatened to evict Jane for non-payment of rent, only to die suddenly while she was nursing him through a minor illness in 1898. And Myra Connors, a friend of Jane's who had loaned her money and then died under Jane's care when the loan came due. The pattern suggested that Jane Toppan's murders were not purely driven by the psychological gratification she described in her confession. In many cases, she appeared to have killed for practical reasons: to eliminate creditors, to inherit property, to escape uncomfortable situations. The line between her pleasure killings and her practical killings was blurred, and investigators could not determine whether the instrumental murders preceded the gratification-based ones, or whether Jane had discovered the pleasure of killing through expedient murders that unexpectedly satisfied some deeper need. The investigation also revealed that Jane Toppan had killed members of her own foster family. Elizabeth Toppan, her foster sister, had died in 1899 under circumstances that now appeared deeply suspicious. Elizabeth had been healthy until Jane moved into her home to care for her during a period of family tension over the Toppan estate. Within weeks, Elizabeth developed the characteristic symptoms of morphine and atropine poisoning and died, leaving Jane as the sole surviving member of the foster family and the primary beneficiary of its modest assets. Even more disturbing was the death of Anne Toppan, Jane's foster mother, in 1891. Anne had been elderly but not infirm, managing her household with the same stern efficiency she had displayed throughout her life. Then Jane arrived to help with the housekeeping, and within a month, Anne was dead. The death had been attributed to natural causes. Anne was, after all, in her 70s, but toxicological analysis of exhumed tissue samples revealed traces of morphine and atropine consistent with poisoning. Jane had killed the woman who had raised her from childhood. She had killed the only person who had ever shown her anything resembling maternal care. And she had done it, apparently, for the modest inheritance that Anne's death would provide, and the satisfaction that she derived from watching another person die at her hands. The psychological portrait that emerged from these investigations was of a woman whose capacity for human connection had been destroyed so completely that she could murder those closest to her without hesitation. Jane Toppan had no friends, only victims in waiting. She had no family, only targets. The cheerful persona that she presented to the world was not a mask concealing dark emotions, but a mask concealing nothing at all. An emptiness so profound that only the act of killing could temporarily fill it. Dr. Stedman, the alienist who had examined Jane for her trial, refined his diagnosis as more information became available. Jane Toppan, he concluded, was a pure example of what the psychiatric literature of the era called moral imbecility, a condition in which the intellectual faculties remained intact while the moral faculties were completely absent. She could plan, she could scheme, she could manipulate others with remarkable skill, but she could not feel empathy, guilt, or remorse, and she could not restrain herself from actions that a normal person would recognize as monstrous. Modern psychiatry would classify Jane Toppan as suffering from severe antisocial personality disorder, likely comorbid with sadistic personality traits and narcissistic features. She would be recognized as a psychopath, a clinical term that had not yet entered common usage in 1902, but that would come to define the type of personality that Jane Toppan exemplified. The case would become a textbook example of the psychopathic killer. Charming, manipulative, utterly lacking in conscience, and capable of maintaining a facade of normalcy that fooled everyone around her. But the labels, however accurate, could not capture the full horror of what Jane Toppan had done. Labels reduced her to a diagnosis, a case study, a specimen to be analyzed and categorized. The reality was simpler and more terrible. She had killed dozens of people, in their beds, in their homes, while they trusted her with their lives. She had held them as they died. She had climbed into their beds and pressed her body against theirs, feeling their hearts slow and their lungs fail. And she had enjoyed it. The survivors of her crimes, the family members left behind, the former employers who had unknowingly harbored a serial killer, carried the burden of that horror for the rest of their lives. Many refused to speak about the case publicly. Others developed symptoms that modern psychology would recognize as post-traumatic stress. Nightmares, intrusive thoughts, inability to trust caregivers or medical professionals. Some moved away from Massachusetts entirely, seeking distance from the communities where Jane Toppan had practiced her deadly art. For the medical profession, the Toppan case was a painful lesson in the dangers of institutional complacency. Hospitals had dismissed Jane despite clear warning signs. They had provided vague references rather than honest assessments of her performance. They had allowed her to move from institution to institution, spreading death wherever she went. because confronting the possibility of a murderous nurse was too uncomfortable to contemplate. The response was gradual, but real. Nursing schools implemented more rigorous screening of applicants. Hospitals developed protocols for investigating unusual patterns of patient death. Professional organizations established codes of ethics that explicitly prohibited the kind of behavior Jane Toppan had exhibited. The profession that Jane had exploited began slowly to develop the safeguards that might prevent another killer from hiding in its ranks, but the safeguards were never complete. The vulnerability that Jane Toppan had exploited, the trust that patients must place in those who care for them, could not be eliminated without eliminating care itself. And so the pattern would repeat, generation after generation. The charming nurse or doctor or orderly, who seemed so dedicated, so competent, so trustworthy, and who was secretly killing the patients in their care. The history of healthcare murder is long and disturbing, and Jane Toppan stands near its beginning. She was not the first to kill under cover of medical care. That distinction belongs to unknown predecessors whose crimes were never detected or recorded. But she was the first American healthcare serial killer to be conclusively identified, prosecuted, and confined, her methods exposed, and her psychology analyzed for the benefit of future investigators. She was the template against which all subsequent healthcare killers would be measured. And she was, in some ways, the most successful. Her career spanned nearly 20 years. Her victim count reached at least 31, probably more. She was caught not through the vigilance of the medical system, but through the suspicions of a retired sea captain whose daughter-in-law happened to die at the wrong time. Without Captain Gibbs's intervention, Jane Toppan might have continued killing for decades more, her crimes hidden behind the routine mortality of the sick and elderly. How many potential Jane Toppans are practicing medicine today? The question is unanswerable, and perhaps it should not be asked too loudly. The vast majority of healthcare workers are exactly what they appear to be, dedicated professionals who have devoted their lives to healing. But the possibility remains, it must always remain, that among them walk the spiritual descendants of Jolly Jane, the nurse who smiled while her patients died. At Taunton State Hospital, Jane Toppan aged gracefully into irrelevance. The 20th century brought world wars, economic collapse, technological revolution, transformations that made the scandal of a Victorian-era serial killer seem quaint and distant. The newspapers that had once devoted entire front pages to the Toppan case found new horrors to report. The public that had once been riveted by her confession found new monsters to fear. Jane followed the news from her hospital room, reading about the world she would never rejoin. She outlived most of the people who had known her during her killing years, the doctors who had employed her, the families she had deceived, the investigators who had brought her to justice. By the 1930s, she was one of the few people alive who remembered the Davis family, who remembered the victims whose names had never made the papers, who remembered what it had felt like to hold a dying person in her arms and watch the light leave their eyes. She never expressed regret for any of it. When asked, late in her life, whether she was sorry for what she had done, Jane Toppan laughed, the same cheerful laugh that had made her Jolly Jane to the families she destroyed. "Sorry?" she said. "I would do it again tomorrow if they let me out. I would do it again tonight. I was born to kill, and killing is what I do best. You can lock me up, but you cannot change what I am." The nurse who had left no patient alive died alone, in a hospital bed, attended by strangers who knew her only as an elderly patient with a disturbing past. No one held her hand as she died. No one climbed into bed beside her to feel her heart slow. She experienced, in the end, the kind of death she had inflicted on so many others, solitary, unwitnessed, unremarkable. But unlike her victims, Jane Toppan chose her death. She controlled it. She decided in those final hours when to let go. The power over life and death that she had craved remained hers until the very end. And somewhere in the unmarked grave where her body lies, Jolly Jane is still smiling. The legacy of Jane Toppan extended far beyond her crimes and her incarceration. She became, in death as in life, a symbol, a cautionary tale invoked whenever society confronted the possibility of evil hiding behind benevolent masks. Her story was told and retold in true crime publications, medical journals, and popular histories, each retelling emphasizing different aspects of her case, depending on the concerns of the era. In the early 20th century, Jane Toppan's story was used to justify restrictions on women in the medical professions. Critics of female nurses pointed to her crimes as evidence that women could not be trusted with the power over life and death that healthcare required. This interpretation was unfair and sexist. Male healthcare workers had committed similar crimes, though they received less attention, but it reflected the anxieties of an era in which women's entry into professional life was still contested. By mid-century, the emphasis had shifted. Jane Toppan became a case study in the emerging field of criminal psychology, her crimes analyzed for what they revealed about the nature of psychopathy and the failures of criminal justice systems to identify and contain dangerous individuals. Researchers noted that Jane had displayed warning signs throughout her career: the suspicious deaths, the missing medications, the strange behavior with patients. But that institutional inertia and the protective assumptions of gender had allowed her to continue killing. In the late 20th century, as feminist criminology emerged as a discipline, Jane Toppan's story was re-examined through the lens of gender and power. Scholars noted that her crimes represented a perverse inversion of the traditional female role. Instead of nurturing life, she had destroyed it, using the trust accorded to women caregivers as a weapon against those she was supposed to protect. Some argued that Jane's crimes reflected the limited options available to women in her era, that murder became a way of asserting power in a society that denied her other forms of agency. Others rejected this interpretation as too sympathetic, noting that Jane's own explanations of her crimes emphasized pleasure rather than protest. What all these interpretations shared was a recognition that Jane Toppan's story was not simply about one disturbed individual, but about the systems that had enabled her crimes. She had killed for 20 years because hospitals failed to share information about dangerous employees. She had killed because families trusted nurses without question. She had killed because the deaths of elderly and sick patients were considered natural and unremarkable. She had killed, in short, because the society around her made killing easy. The reforms that followed her case addressed some of these systemic failures, but not all of them. Background checks became more common. Death investigation protocols improved. Professional oversight increased. But the fundamental dynamic, the patient vulnerable and trusting, the caregiver powerful and largely unsupervised, remained unchanged. And so the killings continued. Generation after generation, the descendants of Jane Toppan, emerging periodically from the shadows of hospitals and nursing homes to claim their victims. In 1981, Donald Harvey began killing patients at Drake Memorial Hospital in Cincinnati. He would eventually confess to 37 murders, committed over 18 years in various healthcare settings. Like Jane Toppan, he had charmed his colleagues and avoided detection through a combination of institutional failures and personal manipulation. Like Jane Toppan, he had killed not primarily for material gain, but for the satisfaction of power and control. In 1984, Janine Jones was convicted of murdering infants in her care at a Texas hospital. The true number of her victims remained unclear, but investigators believed she had killed at least 11 children and possibly many more. Her method, injecting the infants with drugs that caused cardiac arrest, then attempting to resuscitate them, echoed Jane Toppan's technique of bringing patients to the edge of death and back again. In 1999, Harold Shipman, a British general practitioner, was convicted of murdering 15 patients, though a subsequent inquiry concluded that his true victim count exceeded 250, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history. Shipman had killed for decades, his crimes hidden by the same dynamics that had protected Jane Toppan: the trust accorded to medical professionals, the expectation that patient deaths were natural, the reluctance of institutions to investigate their own. And in 2003, Charles Cullen was arrested for murdering patients in New Jersey hospitals. He would eventually confess to 40 killings, committed over 16 years in 9 different healthcare facilities. Each time he was terminated from one job for suspicious deaths, for disciplinary problems, for psychological instability, he found work at another, the pattern of failure following him like a shadow that no one seemed to see. The Cullen case in particular prompted widespread reform of healthcare hiring practices. Hospitals were required to share information about terminated employees. Background checks were expanded to include not just criminal records, but also disciplinary actions and unusual patterns of patient death. State legislatures passed laws mandating investigation of suspicious deaths in healthcare settings. But even as these reforms were implemented, skeptics noted that they addressed only the most obvious manifestations of the problem. The fundamental vulnerability remained. Patients could not protect themselves. Caregivers had access to lethal medications, and the deaths of sick people were expected rather than suspicious. As long as these conditions persisted, there would be opportunities for those who wished to kill. The Jane Toppan case also influenced the development of forensic toxicology, the science of detecting poisons in human tissue. Dr. Edward Wood's analysis of the Davis family's bodies had been pioneering work for its time, but the techniques available in 1901 were crude by modern standards. Over the following century, toxicological methods improved dramatically, making it possible to detect smaller quantities of drugs and to distinguish between therapeutic and lethal doses with greater precision. These advances made it harder for poisoners to escape detection, but not impossible. Modern healthcare killers adapted their methods, using drugs that were harder to detect, timing their murders to coincide with expected deaths, disposing of evidence before autopsies could be performed. The cat-and-mouse game between killers and investigators continued, each side evolving in response to the other's innovations. By the early 21st century, the study of healthcare serial murder had become a recognized subspecialty within criminal justice and criminology. Researchers identified common characteristics of healthcare killers: a history of job instability, a tendency to be present at unusual numbers of patient deaths, a pattern of moving between institutions to escape scrutiny, and personality traits consistent with psychopathy or severe narcissism. These profiles helped investigators identify potential killers, but they also raised ethical concerns. Was it appropriate to treat healthcare workers as suspects based on personality traits or statistical patterns? Did profiling unfairly target innocent workers whose demographics happened to match those of known killers? The balance between public safety and individual rights remained contested. Jane Toppan would have found these debates amusing. She had evaded detection for 20 years, not because investigators lacked profiles or statistics, but because the people around her refused to believe that she could be a killer. The cheerful nurse, the devoted caregiver, the woman who stayed late with dying patients and held their hands as they passed. How could such a person be a monster? The assumption of innocence that protected her was not based on evidence, but on gender and appearance, on the cultural conviction that women who devoted themselves to caring for others must be good. That conviction persisted long after Jane Toppan's crimes were exposed. It continued to protect healthcare killers throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. It allowed families to trust nurses without verification and hospitals to hire employees without thorough investigation. It was, in a sense, the true accomplice in Jane Toppan's murders, the invisible partner that made her crimes possible. The story of Jane Toppan is not, finally, a story about one evil woman. It is a story about a society that created the conditions for evil to flourish, then expressed shock when evil emerged. It is a story about the assumptions we make about gender, care, and trust. Assumptions that can be exploited by those who recognize them as vulnerabilities. And it is a story about the enduring human capacity for denial, the refusal to see what we do not wish to see. In the quiet cemeteries of eastern Massachusetts, the victims of Jane Toppan lie in graves marked by weathered headstones and fading inscriptions. Their deaths were attributed to heart failure, exhaustion, natural causes, the vague diagnoses of an era that did not know how to recognize murder when it wore a nurse's uniform. Their families mourned them, buried them, and moved on, never knowing that the kind woman who had cared for their loved ones in their final hours had also ended their lives. Only the exhumed remain as witnesses. Those whose bodies were dug up years after burial, whose tissues still held traces of the poisons that killed them. They testified, after a fashion, to what had been done to them, but their testimony came too late to save the others. The victims whose graves were never disturbed, whose deaths were never investigated, whose murders were never acknowledged. How many such victims remain? The question haunts the history of Jane Toppan's case. She admitted to killing 31 people, but she also suggested that the true number was higher, perhaps much higher. Investigators confirmed some deaths and suspected others, but the passage of time, the inadequacy of records, and the reluctance of families to disturb the dead limited the scope of their inquiry. Somewhere in the cemeteries of Massachusetts, there may be victims of Jane Toppan who have never been identified, whose deaths have never been counted, whose names have been forgotten along with their murders. And somewhere in the healthcare system of the present day, there may be others like her, nurses and doctors and orderlies who have found in the vulnerability of their patients an opportunity for the exercise of the darkest human impulses. They are rare. The vast majority of healthcare workers are exactly what they seem, but they exist. The history that began with Jane Toppan continues, updated but not ended, the pattern repeating itself with each new generation of killers. The lesson of Jane Toppan is not that we should distrust those who care for us. Such distrust would paralyze the healthcare system and cause more harm than it prevented. The lesson is more subtle and more difficult, that trust should be accompanied by accountability, that care should be monitored, that the deaths of vulnerable people should never be assumed natural without investigation. These principles seem obvious in retrospect. They were not obvious in 1901, when Jane Toppan practiced her deadly art under the protection of a society that could not imagine a nurse as a murderer. They became obvious only through the suffering of her victims and the persistence of those, like Captain Paul Gibbs, who refused to accept comfortable explanations for uncomfortable facts. The nurse who left no patient alive was finally stopped, not by the vigilance of the medical system, but by the stubbornness of a retired sea captain who thought something was wrong and refused to let the matter rest. His insistence on investigation, his willingness to voice suspicions that others considered absurd, his refusal to accept the deaths of his family members as natural. These acts of moral courage brought Jane Toppan to justice when the institutions that should have detected her crimes failed to do so. In the end, the story of Jane Toppan is a story about the power of denial and the courage required to overcome it. It is about a society that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths, and about the individuals who insisted on truth even when it was dangerous and inconvenient. It is about the victims who died trusting those who killed them, and about the survivors who carried the burden of that betrayal for the rest of their lives. And it is about Jane Toppan herself, the orphan from the Boston slums who learned to hide her darkness behind a cheerful smile, who killed for pleasure and power and the satisfaction of watching life drain away. She was a monster, but she was also a product of her time and place, a woman whose capacity for evil was enabled by the failures of the society around her. She died in 1938, alone in an asylum, her crimes largely forgotten by a world that had moved on to new horrors. But her legacy persists in the systems we have built to prevent others like her, in the investigations we conduct when patients die unexpectedly, in the background checks and oversight mechanisms that did not exist in her time. Every protocol that protects vulnerable patients from predatory caregivers is, in some sense, a response to Jane Toppan, an acknowledgement that her crimes revealed truths about human nature and institutional failure that we cannot afford to ignore. The nurse who left no patient alive is still teaching us, more than a century after her arrest. The lesson she offers is simple but essential. Trust, but verify. Care, but supervise. And never assume that kindness on the surface means kindness in the heart. In the unmarked grave at Taunton State Hospital, the body of Jane Toppan has long since returned to the earth. But her story endures, a dark thread woven through the history of American medicine, a reminder of what can happen when evil wears a gentle face and kills with a smile. The summer of 1901 faded into autumn, and the leaves turned crimson and gold across the hills of Cape Cod. The Davis family lay in their graves, and Jane Toppan sat in a jail cell awaiting trial. The world went on, indifferent to the horrors that had unfolded in quiet rooms where sick people trusted their nurse. Somewhere, in a hospital or a private home, another patient was dying. Naturally this time, attended by a genuine caregiver whose only intention was to heal. But the shadow of Jolly Jane lingered over the sick rooms of Massachusetts, a reminder that not all deaths are what they seem, that not all caregivers are what they appear, that the most dangerous predator is sometimes the one who holds your hand as you die. The story ends here, in the silence of forgotten graves and the vigilance that their occupants died to teach us. But it also continues in every hospital ward and nursing home, in every room where the vulnerable are entrusted to the care of strangers. The nurse who left no patient alive is gone, but the conditions that created her remain, waiting for the next Jane Toppan to emerge from the shadows. May we recognize her before it is too late.